Good evening. I've never done a talk without being introduced before, but this is the way we're doing it today. So I'm going to tell you, I am a Narragansett elder. My name is Dawn Dove, and I'm here to welcome you. And it is my pleasure indeed to be here at the John Carter Brown Library. And it's a strange position in some regard for me to be here as a Narragansett woman in this place that was built for men and men alone, I guess, and white men at that. So, but I know things are changing, and things are changing for the better, and it's a good thing. And I see all of you here, and it's wonderful to think of the new programs, this new initiative that's happening here at John Carter Brown Library. It's wonderful that so much of the hidden materials, the documents, the books, the everything that's here with the new technology, the digitization, it's becoming available for not only scholars, I believe, but the community, the indigenous community, activists that are looking to make changes in the world. And I think this is that great start. I certainly want to welcome each and every one of you. I especially want to say thank you to Ned Blackhawk from Yale, who will be speaking to us this evening, all of the honored guests that are here. I also would like to especially welcome the elders that are here. And if there are any Narragansett folk here, I would certainly like to acknowledge them. There we are. As we are on Narragansett land, this is our home. And so it is only fitting that they be noted. I think this new initiative is going to find many new truths out there. I have to smile. Back in the 70s, I think, I was taking a class at Rick, and the topic was, in most disdain, revisionism. Oh, that horrible thing. And of course, I had to write my paper that it was something that was really needed. We needed to revisit all of what had been written in the past and have a new light and look at truths and look at values in a different way. So, as I welcome you each here on this place, I want to say that before I open with words in our language, I especially want to give thanks for all of the teachers. They make such a difference in our lives and the way that we approach the world. And so I also want to thank my elders for the continuance of our language and offer these words in their honor. So, I don't know if you'd like to stand. Kamaya nawan, katanan tamuan kanonash, kanupiaman ka katabatatam mawanan. Wat tiangki kakutam wi tiain na nonag hawan piatat. Nia kwampak kuwanan taman pomantum at wanuwa watiawaha ginawan. Kisakwat kamayanana ka kanauman ni tapnutashmish at kitiang nagutiayu. Kawajna nama wap kamaganatap namajuak pomantum at wunigan mai ka at wanuak nashbi nishnu angtag kawami kitianki tiar Tianquasanash, Nishnu Chag, Naquintamuman, Pomantam Wunigan, Kitiang Yuat, Uchiwami, Wamanitang, Niansh, Quinapuki, Ginawan, Katanu Nawan, Kuwanagan, Kakatuang, Ganonash, at Tamanatamuang, at Manatum, Namanatuman, Napiauman, Ingin Kisakwat, Nashbi, Katab Tab and Tamanash, Katapatamash, Wuchi Kakichi Sanonag, Kakutam Witi Ain Anonag, Kakamaki Sanonag, Katabatash Namanatuman, Wuchiwami, Nuayan Nakwan, Wanitiawang. Katabatash, Wuchiwami, Kamaguanash, Namanatum, Katapatatamish, Kaltantuat, Uchiwami, Nuamanitang, Natangsuag, Ninash. And what I had said was we gather our minds to greet and thank the enlightened teachers who have come. When we forget to live in harmony, they remind us. Today we have gathered and we see that the cycles of life continue. We have been given the duty to live in balance and harmony with each other and all living things. Everything we need to live a good life is here. For all the love that is still around us, we send our choice words of thanks to the Creator. Our Creator, we come unto you today with our thankful hearts. Thank you, Creator, for all the beauty that surrounds us. Thank you for all of your gifts, Creator. Thank you for our elders, our teachers, and our children. Thank you very much, Great Spirit in the sky, for all our beloved relations. Be it so. Thank you.
Good evening. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Narragansett people on whose homelands we meet this evening, and thanking Elder Dawn Dove for her beautiful welcoming remarks. I would also like to thank Library Director Neil Safier for inviting me to speak this evening, as well as the library staff for their hard work in coordinating this week's events. Finally, I extend my gratitude to my mentors and colleagues who will be speaking both today and tomorrow. Deeply thankful to be participating with them in this new Indigenous Studies initiative at the John Carter Brown Library. My name is Tyler Rogers, and I am currently a Ph.D. student in American Studies at Yale University. Working at the intersections of Indigenous Studies and early colonial American history, I researched the linkages between slavery and settler colonialism in native New England. I am also a recent alumnus of Brown University and was one of the many Indigenous student activists and allies involved in the movement to end the formal celebration of Columbus Day at Brown several years ago. I am here with you to offer some very brief reflections about what it means for us to gather together on this particular day, a day recognized as a U.S. federal holiday for the past 77 years. For centuries throughout the Americas, people have commemorated Christopher Columbus's October 12, 1492 arrival in the Bahamas as an annual holiday, celebrating this event as an historically significant moment in the creation of new worlds. Offering alternative interpretations of Columbus's legacy, many decolonial activists cite Columbus's enduring legacies of land theft, sexual violence, and enslavement as worthy of condemnation rather than celebration. Lying at the root of these differing interpretations are fundamental questions about how we remember the past, and perhaps even more importantly, how the ways in which we remember the past inform our present and our future. At Brown, Columbus Day has not been formally celebrated since 2009. This came as a result of student-led protests, petitions, and educational campaigns during the previous year, initiated by members of Native Americans at Brown, or NAB, and in particular, an undergraduate student named Reiko Koyama of the class of 2011. Due to an effective organizing strategy, the movement to end the formal observance of the holiday was supported by a majority of vote at a Brown faculty meeting in April of 2009. Faced with backlash from members of the campus and local communities, many of us involved in the campaign to end the celebration of Columbus Day at Brown were not satisfied with this ostensible victory. Instead, we committed ourselves to ongoing educational programming throughout the following years, cultivating conversations about why the non-observance of Columbus Day matters to Indigenous people today. It is fitting that the inaugural lecture of the JCB's Indigenous Studies Initiative occur on a day so fraught with contested historical meaning. Leading research institutions such as the JCB provide us with invaluable spaces of academic inquiry, encouraging rigorous intellectual exchange about questions that resist simple answers. It is neither possible nor desirable for all of us to agree on our interpretations of the past, but what matters is that we each have stakes in our interpretations and remain committed to processes of scholarly debate. It is in that spirit that I am honored to join you here this evening, and I'm eager to participate in the wonderful dialogues that will emerge from the new Indigenous Studies Initiative lectures at the John Cutter Brown Library. Thank you. And with that, I would like to turn over the podium to Director Neil Safier, who will introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Dawn. Thank you, Tyler, for being willing to share your experiences, your histories, and your languages with us. I think it is certainly one of the first times, if not the first time, that Algonquian is spoken in our midst. So we really appreciate the opportunity to hear other languages and other voices. It's really appropriate, I think, to receive a welcome from a member of the Narragansett tribe this evening. And let me add my own word of welcome to all of you who have come here this evening, especially to other members of New England's Native communities, to members of the library's Board of Governors coming for our Board of Governors meeting, to members of the university administration, to members of Brown's faculty and students, and to friends of the library from near and far. This is, for me, an extremely inspiring moment, and a moment that I hope will plant the seed for future conversations and dialogue around Indigenous studies and, as Tyler so eloquently put, about the place and role of history more generally in our lives. This week, I celebrate my one-year anniversary as director and librarian of the JCB. And what a year it has been. A year ago at this time, on a crisp October morning, I remember walking to campus and seeing something scrawled in chalk on the elegant facade of the library. As I got closer, I was able to see what it actually said. It read, "The third world will rise again." My first reaction, like that of our amazing custodian, Rosa, was to scrub it off as quickly as I could. But upon further reflection, I decided that no, perhaps this was a moment to take advantage of. This was one of those opportunities that arises for reflection and thinking about what it was that people actually thought of when they viewed this building. For it seemed pretty clear to me that whoever it was who scrawled this message on the front of the JCB saw the institution as a symbol of something that I personally had never imagined it to be, and as director felt very strongly that it should never be seen as. That is, as an icon of first world elitism, as a place where the voices of Native peoples or subjugated communities should not be heard, a setting, in short, that emphasized the hegemonic superiority of European culture and civilization and nothing else. This, to me, was a misunderstanding, or at least a misperception, of the kinds of activities that I personally knew went on between these walls. So this new initiative in Indigenous history is really nothing more than an invitation. It's an invitation to conversation, to discussion, to study, and debate. And it begins tonight. The holiday that closed Brown University today, as you heard from Tyler, is a controversial one in many circles, and we don't have to rehearse that history or that debate tonight. But I would like to point out that there are many other alternative interpretations of this day. In Latin America, and in Mexico in particular, it's known as the Dia de la Raza, or the Dia de la Hispanidad, which brings attention to the Hispanic origins of North America's encounter with Europe, and the cultural and ethnic mixing that began on the day in 1492, but continues very much in the present. One author proposed that an alternative holiday would be something that commemorated all of the Americas together. And that is something that seems to me like an institution such as the JCB should stand very strongly behind. Others still, including the city of Berkeley, California in 1992, and more recently Seattle, have renamed the holiday Indigenous Peoples Day. And it is in that spirit of questioning the past and questioning the present that we launch our initiative this evening. My own scholarly work has very much revolved around these questions of encounter and cultural exchange. How we view history as a set of integrated or entangled collections of stories, which include both European and non-European forms of knowledge as legitimate systems of understanding. This kind of approach also raises the question, however, of how we deal with the paucity of sources that shed reliable light on indigenous methods for interrogating and responding to the natural world. And as you look around you here in this library at some of the books that we have within our walls, in some ways it is a testament to Europeans' ability to, in a sense, get the story out there much more than indigenous peoples were able to in terms of print at the minimum. However, what I'd like to suggest and propose, as many scholars have done before me and continue to do, that even these books have within them embedded and entangled history that it is our job to disentangle and to figure out the ways in which we can read alternative stories into this. So expanding the archive of materials and expanding the time frames that we think about history, in this case long before 1492, is part of what we are here to accomplish. So this initiative is meant to provide support for the study of these kinds of methodological questions, but there are more symbolic goals as well. I hope to make the JCB a place where Native students on the Brown campus and elsewhere feel welcomed and supported. I also hope that we can use the institution as a place that will serve as a kind of a clearinghouse for information that is relevant to these communities. On that note, I would like to add that in addition to a fellow that we have speaking, Tricia McEnany, on Wednesday at 4 p.m. in this very room, there is also a talk by Gerald Vizenor, Empire Treasons, Native American Indians in the First World War, on Wednesday afternoon at 6:30. More concretely, the initiative will also take the following forms. We plan to offer a subvention to our traditional fellowship program for Indigenous Studies. This will be for junior and senior scholars to which individuals will apply specifically. And I should also add that this is adding to the kinds of fellowships that we already have. And I must emphasize that it is not that Indigenous questions have never been posed at the John Carter Brown Library before, quite the opposite. But this is in a sense adding further support and more recognition to the importance of these questions. I also hope that this inaugural lecture that we have the privilege of listening to by Ned Blackhawk will be the first in an annual lecture series in Indigenous history and culture. We hope to also add symposia honoring two pioneering scholars of ethnohistory that I learned a lot from personally, and that unfortunately both died long before their careers were over. That is Neil Whitehead from the University of Wisconsin and John Manuel Monteiro from the State University of Campinas in Brazil. All of these initiatives you'll be hearing more about in the coming months, as well as different connections with international institutions who focus on these questions. We had the pleasure of hearing from Hugo Lusitante here at the JCB, a member of the Kofan tribe, who was a protagonist in a film that was shown here at Brown, Oil and Water. And I was able to stand with him as he looked at some of the historical materials from this collection and find on a 1750 map of Quito the name of his tribe, and was able to get the digital copy of that he is going to bring back to Ecuador in order to use it as evidence to argue for the permanent recognition of territories that were originally belonging to his group. So that's the kind of extraordinary fusion of resources and people who can actually instruct us in how best to use those resources. I think that there's no better individual to kick off this dialogue and series than Ned Blackhawk, who is a professor of history at Yale University and noted scholar of Indigenous history and cultural studies. Rather than introducing him myself, however, I'd like to call upon Professor Elizabeth Hoover, who teaches ethnic studies and American studies, and who has been very supportive of this in his incipient initiative. I would also like to say, before I turn things over to Elizabeth, that we will be having a roundtable discussion tomorrow at 4 p.m. With some top-notch scholars in Indigenous history and studies, as well as Indigenous activists, so I heartily welcome you to join us. I would also like to thank the Mellon Foundation, which has provided some seed funding for this initiative, as well as those of you in the audience and elsewhere who have supported the Director's New Initiatives Fund, which has basically provided support for those who you will be hearing from tonight. So we could not have done it without your support as well. And I just want to say how thrilled I am that you're all here, and really look forward to engaging in a continuing conversation on these topics. Thank you.
Hello. I just want to really quickly acknowledge Don again and how powerful that felt to have the Narragansett language resounding off of these stone pillars for probably the first time ever. And so I think that's a beautiful reminder that, as Ned mentioned, there's a paucity of reliable resources kind of written down about Native communities and history, but I think what Don gave us was an excellent reminder that there's a rich oral history in many of our communities. So thank you. And I also want to thank Neil for getting this initiative started this year. So a few years ago, some of us started the Native American Indigenous Studies at Brown Faculty Working Group, and most of our founding members are on leave this year, which left a real dearth of activities. And so it's wonderful that Neil has stepped in to help keep those activities going while we're off frantically writing our books. But tonight I would like to introduce Professor Ned Blackhawk, who's from the Tiamook tribe of Western Shoshone. He's a professor of history and American studies at Yale. He received a bachelor's in history from Yale University and a master's at UCLA, and his Ph.D. in history from the University of Washington. He's currently a faculty member, or he was a faculty member at the University of Wisconsin-Madison from 1999 to 2009, when he then joined the faculty at Yale. In addition to dozens of articles, book chapters, and essays about American Indian history in the American West, Neil is also the author of Violence Over the Land, Indians and Empires in the Early American West, published by Harvard in 2006, which is a study of the American Great Basin that garnered half a dozen professional prizes, including the Frederick Jackson Turner Prize from the Organization of American Historians. This book places the native peoples of the Great Basin at the center of a dynamic and complex story as he chronicles 2 centuries of Indian and imperial history that profoundly shaped the American West. When asked one time what people should take away from Violence Over the Land, Ned remarked that American history has failed to gauge the violence that remade much of the continent before U.S. expansion, and scholars had not fully assessed the effects of such expansion on the many indigenous people caught within these continental changes. Upon arriving at Yale, Ned became the faculty coordinator for the Yale group on the study of Native America, which Tyler now belongs to, and I had the great opportunity to present with last year, which is an interdisciplinary working group that brings together graduate students, faculty, staff from across Yale, as well as scholars in various disciplines, to workshop different works in progress, as well as providing the opportunity to visit museums and archival collections, social events, and national and international conferences. So eventually it'd be wonderful to have something like that here at Brown. So that's a good example for us to look to. In short, Ned's work is important because it gives voice to the indigenous perspective often missed or ignored in recounting the development of the American West. From refuting Julian Stewart's depiction of his people as nomads eking out an inefficient existence on the land, which really resounded with me as somebody who studied environmental anthropology, to complicating the Lewis and Clark expedition, Professor Blackhawk's work gives agency to people otherwise depicted as helplessly caught up in the ravages of colonization. So tonight, Ned will be presenting on The Rediscovery of America, American Indians and the Unmaking of U.S. History. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ned Blackhawk.
Wow, what a wonderful set of introductions. I can't really thank Elizabeth, Dawn, Tyler, and Neil enough for the generous and heartfelt introductions that you've each provided. Thank you all. Thank you all for coming. The last time Elizabeth and I saw each other was about 3 weeks ago in New York at the Climate March and the UN World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, events that really imprinted themselves on those of us from our Yixna and Yale community who were able to attend. As many of you may know, Professor Hoover is similarly engaged in a series of important collaborations between academic, tribal, and environmental communities, collaborations that really represent the forward directions that the field of Native American studies is moving. So thank you, Elizabeth, Dawn, Tyler, and Neil, and the greater JCB community for both the invitation to be here tonight and for the hard, steadfast efforts to bring these important subjects to bear here within your very wonderfully elegant institutional space. I'd also like to extend a special note of appreciation to the extended Native American community here at Brown, who recently hosted delegations of Indigenous students from across the Ivy League, and who have been particularly active, as Tyler noted, within the region over the past many years, helping to raise the profile of Indigenous studies and commemorations here in the greater Northeast. Indigenous Peoples Day has always been, and I hope will always remain, a time of both pride and self-interrogation, a sobering as well as hopeful moment. And I'd like to begin my presentation, as Dawn clearly indicated, with the recognition that we are today gathered now upon the ancestral homelands of the Narragansett, as well as other Algonquin-speaking communities of greater Rhode Island and eastern Connecticut, whose beautiful autumnal lands I happened to drive across earlier this afternoon. We meet today at a particularly hopeful as well as uncertain moment in the study and history of Native North America, one that has yet to be fully named or assessed. A time that would have been inconceivable 25 years ago when I was a first-year university student. Then, unlike now, the second Monday in October occasioned very few commemorations on the traumatic legacies of European expansion into the Americas. Then, the native peoples of the United States remained largely outside the nation's public sphere, consigned seemingly perpetually to the distant past in museums, in movies, as well as in academic writings and institutions. Indian gaming, the hemispheric awakenings around the Columbian Quincentenary of 1992, the opening of the National Museum of the American Indian 10 years ago last month, and the countless and daily efforts of indigenous peoples across the Americas to overcome century-old biases and prejudices. These are a few of the seismic calibrations that make today's commemoration both different as well as possible. And I hope that such context helps to introduce my talk this evening, one that may come as a bit of a surprise to those of us outside the field of Native American studies, and one that I hope confirms what many of us in the field have already come to know, namely, that the history of our nation, our continent, and our hemisphere has been fundamentally recast in recent years. Indigenous history, as the field is increasingly becoming known, has not only arrived professionally with scholars now like myself at Yale, at Michigan, at Stanford, at Columbia, many of whom are recently appointed. The field has not only arrived professionally, but it has also recentered critical aspects of American and indeed world history. Indeed, an indigenous reckoning is now upon us, as U.S., Canadian, New Zealand, Australian, Bolivian, Mexican, Norwegian, and even Finnish national communities, among others, are confronting the legacies of what is increasingly becoming known as settler colonialism. And I mention some of these countries quite intentionally, since the Mexican, Finnish, Bolivian, as well as Estonian presidents all recently conveyed their respective nations' growing recognition of indigenous rights before the UN General Assembly last month at the World Conference. From debates about the sustainability of extractive resource economies to the complicity of the nation state in cultural genocide, scholars, governmental officials, and most notably, indigenous community members are reassessing the nature of our global community, doing so often in dialogue with international environmental and human rights movements. So the story I'd like to tell today may not adequately reflect or connect with these ambitious assertions, but I believe this story is linked to them. Like the political current so quickly refashioning North America's native rights movements, particularly north of here, where today is a national holiday known as Canadian Thanksgiving, speaking of different forms of commemoration, this story that I'm trying to relay is in various stages of conceptualization. There is a growing certainty to it that I feel will hopefully become apparent by the end of my presentation today. Because not only are we living in an era of unprecedented forms of cultural awareness, growing forms of particularly economic and political autonomy within Native American communities, these developments are paralleling as well as at times importantly intersecting with scholarly and academic investigations into the history of our nation. Something profound is underway, a process of really revolutionary academic and intellectual potential. Not only has this field arrived, it is dramatically contributing to a broader reorganization of our nation's past, a process that I'm terming tonight the Unmaking of U.S. history. Gone now are the days when indeed the nation and as well as hemispheres, indigenous populations could be so readily dismissed or ignored by our nation's historical community. For those of us within the field, we all know that it's a maxim to say that revising interpretations of the past is essential to historical inquiry. And nowhere are such revised reinterpretations more apparent than in the study of Native American history, particularly within the early American past. So it's quite fitting that the theme of this initiative here is entitled The Earliest Americas, because it reflects the slow, quiet, but eventual revolution that has occurred in how the study of early American history is now practiced. When and where American history begins, who constitutes its primary subjects, and what are the driving and determining forces behind the eventual creation of the United States? A generation of scholars has reconsidered such questions, and their answers have powerfully recast the field. There is an ascendancy that has occurred in the last 20 years, bless you, that I'll be talking about, that stands obviously in marked contrast to many preceding generations of historical inquiry. For most of our nation's past, it should come as no surprise to hear, scholars have generally considered American Indians either too culturally different or simply too unimportant for rigorous historical investigation. The ethnographic, cultural, linguistic, and political distinctions that have characterized American Indian societies for millennia seemingly once prohibited historical inquiry, while broader venues of U.S. popular culture, most notably 20th century Hollywood, reinforced timeless, negative, and one-dimensional portraits of indigenous peoples. So if nothing else, being an indigenous or Indian historian for the past 20 years has been quite exciting. And while, as Neil and Elizabeth indicated, and while Western, or what has now increasingly become known as borderlands history, in which my first book was particularly engaged, while those fields, most Indians live west of the Mississippi, the oldest permanent European colonial settlements are found in the American Southwest, while Western history has most regularly exposed the vibrancy of American Indian history as a field, studies of Indian and imperial relations that I'll be speaking about this evening inaugurated the ascendancy that I've just sketched. And I'm going to talk largely about this ascendancy this evening, and about how a few and then many works emerged that slowly and then nearly exponentially cracked open the once hermetically sealed nature of early American history. So whereas studies of what I described as Indians and empires in the early American West now routinely garner recognition, such was not the case on the eve of the Columbian Quincentenary, when Indian history remained largely outside the frames of academic and historical investigation, when countless textbooks, university graduate programs, professional associations, and academic institutions either routinely dismissed or simply did not recognize this field of inquiry. A series of works from the early 90s challenged and ultimately changed such exclusionary practices. One book in particular, written by my advisor, Richard White, now at Stanford, and subtitled Indians and Empires and Republics in the Great Lakes Region, the theme of Indians and Empires of early America then. This work offered an unprecedented reconceptualization of early American history. It literally took me from one program to another upon interrogation, taking my life seemingly into a new place and time simply because of its insights and transformative impacts upon me. It took the theme of colonialism's impacts upon Native peoples more seriously than any study up to its time. And the book's title, obviously, is The Middle Ground. And more than any other, it ruptured the geographic or spatial as well as temporally bounded field of U.S. colonial history. And by extension, as I'll show shortly, once you rupture or begin tinkering or remodifying the foundations of some established form, the rest of the either institution, field of inquiry, paradigm, edifice, structure starts to get reconfigured. And this is what has happened to American history, since it recasts both the temporal and spatial chronology of American history at a time when U.S. colonial history focused almost exclusively upon British North America and its diverse social, economic, and religious communities. Prominent works in African American and Southern history had dislodged the field's once exclusive focus on New England, but by and large, early America remained synonymous with the Anglo-American and Anglophone world. We all can't see this map on the overhead projector. It has a shaded region around the world's 5 largest freshwater lakes, known as the Great Lakes. A region the French termed the High Country, or the Pays d'en Haut, where the 2 great waterways of eastern North America both originate, the Mississippi and the St. Lawrence Seaway. That is the scene, this Great Lakes region, from the title of The Middle Ground. And this work opens not with static, one-dimensional, or ethnographically with ethnographic attempts to describe or detail the pre-Columbian or pre-contact nature of indigenous life and culture. It opens in the midst of what was white terms at the time. It opens in the midst of a diaspora. In the midst of fur trading wars initiated in the mid-1600s by gun-possessing Iroquois communities to the east who had become incorporated into violent economic spheres of trading relations between the Dutch and the French to their both respective north and south, and their subsequent push west into other communities, Algonquin-speaking communities, fur trading and subsequent territorial homelands in a world that White claims is the most violent to have ever existed in Native American history. It concludes at the end of the War of 1812, and essentially is nearly a 2-century chronicle of a world in which the English language was hardly ever spoken, at least not spoken until roughly the mid to late 1700s. What an ambitious temporal focus. Why 1650, the beginning? That's when the French began moving into these western territories. Why does the first chapter end in 1701? At the time of the beginning of the imperial playoff system between the French Empire and their Algonquin-speaking allies in one central part of central North America, the Iroquois communities of the Ohio River Valley and upstate New York, and another, as well as then the emergence of an English-speaking British North American empire along the Atlantic. All of these questions and many, many others are powerfully addressed in the study, which introduced a whole new lexicon for interpreting early American history, treating, as I just suggested, at its center, not the Anglo-American world, or even European colonies, to be honest. There are very few French settlements west of Montreal throughout the history of New France. Smaller territorial formations in places like St. Louis, Detroit, Michilimackinac are relatively and comparatively much smaller demographically than are the village communities of indigenous peoples across really the entire continent, but particularly in this case across the Ohio River and Great Lakes region. Even within, as many of us may know, Francophone territorial settlements, many are Métis and mixed race and highly multilingual and multicultural worlds that resemble colonial settlements along the Atlantic in very different forms. This high country, which the French term the great freshwater lakes, out of which these 2 great arteries originated, is now seen, because of this book and subsequent ones, as a great engine of historical transformation across the 17th and especially 18th century North American landscape, a region of historical importance comparable to the other great regions of early America, like New England, the Chesapeake, or the Carolinas. The middle ground, in many ways, demolished the then operating geographic and temporal paradigms of the field. And the results of this analysis, the kind of remaking or unmaking of early American history, the kind of rediscovery of interior historical landscapes and worlds that had previously been either excluded or uninterrogated by historians, despite, as we could look throughout the shelves of this institution, copious documentary records about many of these encounters. Despite the historical diversity within these communities, they had remained outside of the purview of scholarly focus. And the results of the investigations that White and others have initiated have yielded fundamentally new understandings of the 18th century's two most dramatic conflicts: the 7 Years' War, which raged roughly in North America from 1754 to 1760, and the American Revolution of 1776 to 1782. And once you rework assessments about particularly the American Revolution, everyone in the profession starts paying attention. It's one thing to say that the fur trade was an important economic development in New France. It's quite another to say that the final contest between France and England in North America both originated in conflicts between Indians and English settlers in the Ohio River Valley, as well as fueled subsequent tensions between settlers and English authorities thereafter. The unprecedented expenditures, logistical organization, and complex legacies of the 7 Years' War ultimately helped to fracture relations between England and its colonists, as scholars, most notably Fred Anderson, now contend. Anderson, who teaches U.S. colonial and military history at the University of Colorado, wrote a magnum opus about the 7 Years' War entitled Crucible of War, which is subtitled The 7 Years' War and the Fate of Empire in British North America. This monumental doorstop of a book subsequently became a more user-friendly, pedagogically appropriate, and then subsequent PBS television series entitled The War That Made America, a much shorter, condensed version of the larger study from which Anderson devoted much of his late career towards. He, in fact, says in the introduction to this book that it's the 7 Years' War that had the largest impact upon the 18th century North American landscape, more so than did the American Revolution. Those are his words or his suggestions that I'm paraphrasing, not mine. That's one of Bernard Bailyn's students from Harvard. Those are his suggestions, and he's essentially was spending his time in the, I guess, 80s and 90s, I really don't know Anderson at all, synthesizing, reading, and trying to keep up with these indigenous histories that White and other Iroquoianists had been writing. Indian histories then made such insights possible, and Indian affairs now remain essential factors not only in the calculus of the American Revolution, which at the time I thought was an enormous achievement, and still do, but Indian affairs are also becoming increasingly recognized as have an increasingly central place in the global history of the age of empires and revolutions. And I have to kind of recognize and pause to say that one of my former students and TAs is here in the evening, Christine DeLucia at Mount Holyoke. And as she knows well, I really enjoy not just maps, but the maps from this book. So please forgive me, Christine, for charting some familiar territory perhaps with you. And with keeping with the theme of rediscovery, it wasn't until I saw the maps in this book that I realized, after 10 years of graduate training and a couple years of faculty instruction, how this field has changed. This is one of the maps that shows where the 7 Years' War begins. So many of us may know that a young Virginian colonel is charting interior landscapes of western Pennsylvania near the confluence of the three rivers that once held title over a baseball stadium in the city of Pittsburgh. Washington's first military encounters occur initially in 1753 and then later in 1754 under the direction of a British general named Braddock, who will be routed there in this borderland between empires, in the space on the margins, much like the field of indigenous history, present but not recognized. That is where the most important war, according to Fred Anderson, begins in the 18th century North American world. And the map that I now put up is the map of all maps for me that reveals this field's ascendancy. You can't see it. It says the progress of the 7 Years' War and associated conflicts. There's 20 what look like kind of flashed numbers across the globe. The first of which I circled in pencil is at the confluence of the Allegheny, Ohio, and Monongahela rivers. The second is in Nova Scotia. The third is in the Hudson River. The fourth is along the Mohawk Valley into Lake Ontario and the upper St. Lawrence Seaway. But the fifth is the Battle of Minorca. The sixth is in Central Europe. The seventh are operations in Bengal, and the Battle of Plessy, it's called, from 1757. That's over here. The eighth is the siege of Louisburg at the mouth of the St. Lawrence Seaway, the main artery to reaching the Great French Empire of North America. The ninth are West African expeditions. The 10th is the fall of Quebec, the cover of his book, and the subsequent siege and conquest of Montreal. The 11th are conflicts occurring in the Eastern Caribbean. The 12th are British naval operations off Gibraltar, the coast of France. 13, the Upper Great Lakes, where Niagara is sieged. There's a southern dimension to the war among the Cherokee in 15. And on, including the siege of Havana, the conquest of Manila, and for me, most kind of representative of the profound legacy of the Middle Ground is the 20th and last theater of this war for Anderson that occurs further west from the war's beginnings, where around Detroit, the Pontiac and a group of Algonquin military and religious leaders attempt, after the fall of France, after France has ceded its North American territories to the British at the Treaty of Paris in 1763, ending formally the conflict. The indigenous peoples in the interior began a process of revitalization, alliance, and confederation, where they say to themselves and to their newly arrived English rulers, we will not tolerate a position of subordination in the aftermath of this conflict, this global conflict, unprecedented, the most important war, the first global war, according to Francis Jennings. The British recognized, last thing the British want is another war, or really even another empire that won so dramatically. The French, the Spanish will get involved in the conflict on behalf of the French and will lose numerous territories and possessions. The English will end up with all of the French territories in North America. The Spanish will take the western Louisiana portions, which will subsequently give back to the French once Napoleon conquers France.
Yes, can you use the mic? Because otherwise the acoustics here are terrible.
Okay, well, I'm kind of just sketching the nature of this conflict. We can read about it, and maybe I should move on too. So, at any rate, this is the map of Anderson's book that I routinely utilize and turn to convey the field of indigenous history's ascendancy, and not just adding or complicating or integrating indigenous peoples into previously established chapters or paradigms of American history, but in reworking the nature of such fields of investigation. 7 Years' War then begins unexpectedly in the interior portions of eastern North America and concludes further west in what Richard White terms the reestablishment of the Middle Ground. And we'd have to really interrogate what those relationships mean to really understand the subject. Perhaps we could turn to them and read them in more extended form. And obviously the fragile alliance between the British and their now newly incorporated Algonquin-speaking subjects across the interior portions of former New France won't hold. Because another subsequent conflict, one rooted in the costs of this war, one rooted in the familiarity gained between the 13 British colonies and their interior landscapes, with familiarities developed between themselves, with the introduction of new ideas emanating from Europe, the kind of growing tyrannical practices of the monarchy, the passing along of the taxes and costs of this war to the colonists themselves, all of the kind of consequences of this war, which have deeply imprinted indigenous influences, one can begin to now identify. This was inconceivable intellectually, historiographically, we would say in the profession, not too long ago. And we could continue such investigations across the colonial world into the 19th century and extend them into the 20th, uncovering the increasingly recognized centrality of indigenous communities and power to the making of North America. We could do a similar analysis for the 19th century on the ways in which North American indigenous communities both shaped and were shaped by the Haitian Revolution, another one of the many legacies of the 7 Years' War. I like to kind of point out that the Second Treaty of Paris in 1783, which ends the American Revolution, brings no peace to the interior, and the colonists themselves, and now independent republic, understands the need for a stronger federal government to handle numerous kind of forms of governmental authority and governance. So they lodge the power over Indian affairs in their new chartering document known as the U.S. Constitution, putting just 5 words in the Commerce Clause of Article 1, Section 8 of the Commerce Clause that reads, the federal government shall have jurisdiction or authority, the power to regulate commerce, trade between the states, and with the Indian tribes. Those 5 words are recognition of the kind of necessity that the colonists understand for creating new forms of governance for dealing with indigenous communities. Those 5 words and subsequent Supreme Court rulings, policies, and deliberations will lodge the power of federal authority over indigenous communities in ways that is still with us to this day, obviously, placing in Indian affairs under the jurisdictions of the federal government and not the states. So we could do those types of analyses for some time. We can move into the 20th century and look at a few recent very prominent works that have lately reframed, among other things, the urban history of America, particularly in the Southwest, and draw upon a really brilliant book that just came out by NYU's Andrew Needham, entitled Power Lines, Phoenix and the Making of the Greater Southwest, which shows how Phoenix, at the dawn of World War II, had less than, I think, 70,000 people. It now has, I don't know how many fold larger, but several million in its greater metropolitan area, and how the electricity that fueled the rise of Phoenix is particularly residential communities and their use of air conditioning was rooted in extractive coal resource development across the Hopi and Navajo reservation homelands. And perhaps look at the federal government's policies in the aftermath of the Second World War, when the federal government was attempting to terminate indigenous communities, to return them to the jurisdiction of states, and look at perhaps a few Arizona senators like Barry Goldwater, who helped broker these very one-sided power development deals between the federal government and particularly the Navajo Nation, which recently just received a $500 million settlement for federal neglected mismanagement of their natural resources, and perhaps remind ourselves that the federal government has, according to federal constitutional law and Supreme Court rulings, a kind of fiduciary responsibility akin to a ward and its guardian over indigenous communities. So we could continue doing these types of analyses more broadly. I'm currently doing some kind of investigations into the field of genocide studies, another field with certain temporal and spatial presumptions that I've tried to kind of draw attention to. The most famous book about America and genocide is the Pulitzer Prize-winning book by Samantha Power, now U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, entitled A Problem from Hell, America and the Age of Genocide, that begins with a very revealing epigraph from Abraham Lincoln, that we, even we here, hold the power and bear the responsibility. Those of us perhaps unfamiliar with Power's work could see it, like the field of genocide studies more broadly, as beginning in the 20th century, beginning at a time linked with modernity and taking place someplace. But someplace not here, because we here hold the power and we bear a responsibility for problems from elsewhere. And if we were to spend some time kind of interrogating this field of inquiry, analyzing its presumptions, and thinking through whether or not the UN's 1948 definition of genocide is applicable to the history of settler indigenous relations in North America, we might find ourselves somewhat startled to see the kind of leading studies of genocide not really tackle or engage with the clearly destructive sets of relationships between indigenous and state communities here in North America. And we might, some of us know that I think the world's largest human rights museum just opened a few weeks ago in Winnipeg, Manitoba in Canada, and that many First Nation or Aboriginal communities in the north withdrew from the commemorative openings of that facility for its inability to introduce this term into its exhibits, nomenclature, and a stated goal and mission. So we could continue down these paths of investigation for some time, exposing further and further the increasingly recognized centrality of indigenous peoples to the place and course of American history. I hope it's clear that such inquiries are doing more than simply adding Native peoples to a more robust or inclusive vision of our nation's past. The field of indigenous studies, as Maori scholar Linda Smith has most powerfully suggested, is not simply trying to add an indigenous element into an either multiracial or multicultural vision of the history of nation states, a process that Native scholars, and particularly Canada, are drawing increasingly prominent attention to the limits of such incorporative models. Canada has had national apologies, truth and reconciliation committees, as well as a royal commission that have all characterized Native Canadian affairs over the last 2 decades, particularly since the 1990 standoff between Native peoples and national armies outside of Montreal, known as the Oka Crisis, North America's longest military standoff of the 20th century, in which several community members as well as provincial police officers were both wounded and killed. Such works, insights, and avenues of investigation call into question various, not just approaches, but uses of the past, exposing both limitations in existing narratives, as well as often the perpetuation of under-interrogated practices and exclusionary logics. And Mohawk scholar Audra Simpson has particularly called into question the kind of operating logics of national citizenry, or the policies of and prescriptive policies of citizenship in Canada that have always been unable to reconcile and incorporate Indigenous communal, matriarchal, and social practices into their often highly gendered and prescriptive forms. In my own work, in conclusion, I've tried to expose the ways in which these earliest historical landscapes remain really beyond full contemporary interrogation and clear observation. And so, like my advisor's book, I've taken, as have many, the kind of series of really kind of particularly early American regional histories that many have now rendered, that have kind of taken the kind of synthetic historiographical challenge of locating not just indigenous peoples within the early American past, but trying to query the kind of meanings of the early American past by focusing on sets of indigenous imperial relations, as well as inter and intra-indigenous relations that have hitherto previously been under interrogated. So the beginning slide that I showed was from really one of my favorite historical national park spots, an unexcavated pre-Columbian Puebloan community outside of what is the more commonly visited site known as Bandelier National Monument. This mesa unexcavated pre-Columbian village known as Sankowe sits about 30 miles northwest of Santa Fe, New Mexico, and comes from my time in the Southwest when I was starting a study of trying to locate the Intermountain West, the homelands of various Shoshone-speaking indigenous Ute, Paiute, as well as obviously Shoshone communities. Communities that, as Elizabeth mentioned, had remained outside of the kind of purview of scholarly analysis and often been what we would call essentialized or ethnographically rendered as timeless or primitive in the anthropological literature. In an attempt to kind of reckon with the indigenous histories that characterize this region, I traveled to New Mexico to try to find out what the first kind of colonial disruptions might look like and entail, and spent much of the mid to late 1990s trying to figure this subject out. And you can't really make sense of this kind of shaded region north of New Mexico. Again, New Mexico is the oldest permanent European colony in North America, founded in 1598. To give you a sense of the kind of historical memory of the region, it shares a 320-mile border with the state of Colorado, which became incorporated as a state in the American Union in 1876, and likes to call itself the pioneer state. So one state to the south has over 400-year history of European settlement, indigenous, and as well as Hispanic interior history that not only predates that of the United States, but has in fact existed longer than the history of longer than this region has been part of the United States. So one region, one state, has this kind of triadic historical sense of collective memory. The other, perhaps less triadic. And the history of that state is now becoming increasingly drawn into focus because we are commemorating this year, last year and next, the sesquicentennial of the American Civil War. And some of the most violent and brutal chapters in Western North American indigenous history occurred during the war itself, and involved lots of military leaders as well as Native communities from this region, as well as particularly from Colorado, where the Sand Creek Massacre of November 29th, 1864, has drawn into kind of focus this state's kind of historical, perhaps inability to recognize or contend with the indigenous histories of violence and displacement that characterize its documentary as well as geographic landscape. A little further to the northeast of Colorado, on the map, there's a little triangle that shows a battle from 1720. This battle comes at a time so long before subsequent historical documentation that this image and others are kind of included in some of my published scholarly works if you're really interested in learning more about them. But I thought I would just kind of highlight briefly and in conclusion, the ways in which I've tried to use various types of methods and concepts and forums to try to make sense of these anterior settlement histories, and doing so with very, very, very few, often documentary records. That kind of trying to utilize, as Neil was suggesting, the kind of extant, often fragmentary, European-produced documentary records to try to glean insights into this often under-documented or archived world. And one of perhaps my favorite historical image is now housed in the Palace of Governors in Santa Fe. It's a deerskin hide, about half the size of that tapestry, or the bottom half, that has been rendered in kind of conventional Baroque artistic tapestry form that highlights an unknown battle between equestrian indigenous community members and non-equestrians in the American Southwest. And it comes from the time of that previous battle that came from the Nebraska plains that I won't really have time to detail, known as the Villa Sur massacre and battle, when a group of Spanish and Pueblo military fighters and campaign members from New Mexico are routed by a French Algonquian alliance group of communities in the heart of the continent. So American colonial history is now occurring. Our scholars are trying to interrogate literally the history of the center of the continent at the time before 1720 is before the slave trade has been established to Charleston in a substantial way. It's before much of the American South, before the state of Georgia is kind of incorporated, before Oglethorpe's experiences in the southern parts of the Carolinians. This history of the interior, of what we call borderlands, Western history, is now producing kind of remarkably sophisticated and just astonishingly uncommon insights into places, some of which we will never know, like the scene of this battle, in which indigenous communities, some of whom possess horses, as we can see, some of whom possess equestrian armor for their horses, leather equestrian armor. They themselves are also wearing leather armor, and perhaps most importantly, or equally important to the use of horses, is that they're using and carrying metals that those who rendered this tapestry understood were important to differentiate. So they painted them in a distinctive blue, indigo coloring. And they're attacking peoples who don't have horses, peoples who really don't have armor, and have very, very few metals. And that history of what happens between those who are proximate to and allied with Europeans and those who are at distance from these colonial centers is really also much of the history of the 18th century North American Western landscape, a history of known but unrecorded forms of trauma, of countless raids, battles, and attacks between peoples searching for materials from each other, and doing so in what I've termed the maelstrom of colonialism. So far from being timeless, one-dimensional, ahistorical, or natural historical communities, North America's indigenous communities remain a part of a larger global epic, a part of the violent edges of empire. An indigenous acumen, diplomacy, intentionality, protection of their homelands, both from settlers as well as from other indigenous peoples, are now commonly recognized forms of historical inquiry that are contributing to this larger process of transformation that I sketched this evening. By taking such long-standing and deeply reconfigured regional history seriously, scholars have made opportunities to approach our nation's past more accessible and have produced more capacious and ultimately informed ways of interrogating the North American landscape and its history. We are now at a point in our nation's history where we are really for the first time able to begin to rediscover America. It's been my pleasure sharing such assessments with you here this evening, and I'd be happy to answer any questions following this formal proceeding or at a potential reception or commingling among ourselves to follow. Thank you very much.
With sensitivity to both the desire to open a conversation, but also the sensitivity to those who would like to have a drink, I thought that we might maybe take a couple of questions and then begin the informal process that Ned outlined. So if there are any particular questions before we adjourn the informal part? George.
Was there indigenous people before on the North American continent before the American Indians?
Were there peoples in North America before Native Americans? No. Not the way we would describe human communities in our current form. There are debates about the peopling of the Americas that I really don't keep too close a tab of, partly because they change very often, as do the kind of estimates, the demographic estimates that characterize the history of the Western Hemisphere at the time of European arrival, that range anywhere between 50 and 200 million, with scholars kind of taking a kind of generally recognized moderate compromise of around 75 to perhaps 100 million, making the Western Hemisphere as populous as was Europe at the time of contact. But the actual peopling of that of the Americas is really a field left to archaeologists and those who are using kind of physical forms of material culture that can be dated in various kind of carbon dated or scientific forms.
Some of whom, I should say, we also have in the audience.
Oh, wonderful.
This evening, so you might want to refer to those people.
Well, I'd refer you to them. I'm happy to learn as well.
Another burning question before we turn things over. Well, I would just like to say then to thank Ned for coming.
Thank you.
And for giving what I thought was an extremely evocative overview of some of the ways in which different kinds of resources and different kinds of materials can force us to re-interrogate some of our larger beliefs and larger historical understanding. So thanks again, and please join us for the reception.
Thank you.